Okay. So what we're going to discuss today is the Cold War on the home front. And the Cold War is defined as the period from the end of World War II all the way till 1989, give or take. So I'm going to look at how the Cold War impacted US home front economy and society here. Make sure you also look at the text. Chapter 28 talks about the 1950s and Cold War America as well. And there's also some films that I uploaded, 3 different films that give you a little snippet into the United States in the 1950s around this issue. If you just scroll down, here's one called Duck and Cover. Here's a short 2-part thing about how you should live in a fallout shelter if we do get nuked. And finally, an advertisement for a suburban home you can buy. And more Americans, millions of Americans, were able to afford a suburban home in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. Okay. Later on today, I'm going to be recording a lecture about gender roles in the United States in the 1950s, and I'm going to ask you to watch this one short film called Mr. and Mrs. America, and it's quite telling about expected gender roles for middle-class white Americans. Okay, so now let me go to the lecture. But I can't see you all. Where are you? Oh, I wasn't sharing my screen, was I? Darn it. Well, I just was showing you assignment 3 on the webpage. So that's all you missed. You just didn't miss any information. Okay. So let's go to the lecture. Homefront. So the issues I'm going to be talking about today is what factors led to post-war prosperity in the US. And the big question is, remember, expand on the big question a little more than you do the others. How did the Cold War fears and prosperity shape American culture? And I'll take a second to have you look at this image here. What strikes you about this image? Just look at it. How is it displaying US life? And this is at the United States History Museum in Washington, DC.
All of the new technology is like front and center. There's a TV, there's a refrigerator.
Yeah, Rachel or Ari, what else do you see?
I noticed it looks like a picture of like a suburb in the background.
For sure, the explosion of suburban America, right? Cul-de-sac America. And right, look at this now. Americans now have, oh, there it is. Hold on, let me get my chat up. Where's my chat? Yeah, Ari says, what strikes you question about duck and cover, et cetera, are those part of the big question? Yeah, go ahead and include these films, because these films here really capture how Cold War fears and prosperity shaped American culture. So great question, Ari. Yes is the answer to that. So you have to remember, in the 1950s, America had just experienced, a decade-long Great Recession, a long time during World War II in which there's a lot of rations, right? So Americans, 2 decades of rationing. Now in the 1950s, boom, you can go and buy yourself a GE refrigerator and just pack it with food, right? And you can expand your living room. You can buy yourself a TV, and they're getting much more numerous and cheaper to buy. So Americans are being connected more than ever, right, around this medium we call television. Most Americans are embracing conformity. We'll also talk about how there's a rebellion against this conformity, really, that manifests in the 1960s in the counterculture. But during this time, most white Americans are enjoying much more wealth than they did previously and moving into the suburbs. But there's one glaring thing, well, there's a few glaring things that this one display misses. What do you think it is? Any guesses? Oh, the woman's pointing at a jet, exactly. Right, so there's an increasing, this is actually propeller engine, but I get what you mean. Passenger air travel is much more common and getting cheaper for many Americans. What's a big thing that isn't displayed here? There's many to choose from, but can you think of any?
It looks like it's supposed to be like a family, but we're missing a husband. Ari just said it in the chat.
Yeah, the husband. Well, the husband might be off to work. And see this image on the left, it shows all the men in their same gray suits going to work. You're right, it's a domestic, it's an image of domesticity. You're right, there's no husband and there's no image of an atomic bomb. So another thing you have to remember about this idyllic, many people look back at the 50s as that's when America was great. You also have to think we were living under the threat of nuclear annihilation, right? We had just bombed Japan twice. Russia had just tested their first atomic bomb just a couple years later. So now you have these two superpowers who are at political loggerheads with each other and fighting over various spheres of influence in the globe. I'm going to be lecturing about that in assignment 3, part 3. We'll look at the international scene. But what's more is now the US and the USSR even had a much more powerful bomb, the hydrogen bomb. This thing was huge. It makes what happened in Nagasaki and Hiroshima seem like child's play. And look at this. This is an actual image of a test in Nevada. And these soldiers are about a mile away just checking out the bomb going, whoa, check it out. Isn't that crazy? So about a year ago, the State Department released declassified footage of nuclear bomb tests and how they went about, and it's really fascinating to watch. So in the extra credit part of assignment 3, I included that clip for you. So check that out if you want, extra credit assignment 3. Interestingly, some of the most nuked areas of the world, it wasn't Japan, it was the United States, Nevada, places in the Soviet Union where these bombs were tested. Between 1945 and 1962, the US tested 219 nuclear bombs above the ground. And again, mostly in Nevada. Isn't that a crazy image? Look at all these soldiers. Why do you think the soldiers were there watching? It was just like a Saturday afternoon get together? Why do you think they were out there watching it? Any guesses, Joey, Rachel, or Ari?
Might it be some sort of like military exercise?
Yeah, and the military scientists wanted to test how this affected the human body. Remember, this is a relatively new technology. So later on, these soldiers were tested to see what happened to them.
Did they? Well, sorry. So they're testing how radiation affects humans.
Yep.
That's a lot of people.
Yep.
Are those people who volunteered to do that, or were they?
No, people in the military follow orders. So no, they were following orders. Oh, and by the way, most of the generals were about another mile away in concrete bunkers. Please don't believe me on that. Check it out. Desert seem really empty in life. Yeah, they're on no wild horses in Nevada. Well, there's not any wild horses in that area right now. Well, right then. After 1962, we passed a series of laws that said no more above ground nuking. We nuked over 1,000, exploded over 1,000 bombs underground after that. And the test didn't stop until 1992. So my point here is that many Americans were living in prosperity, had wealth, had jobs, but they were also living under the specter of mutually assured destruction if the Soviet Union would bomb us. So what did policymakers and government folks try to do to assuage our fears, meaning to lessen our fears? On one hand, they came up with a couple kind of cutesy, cartoony, how to protect yourself in nuclear war. And this is one of the films you're going to be watching. And this one's, absurd, and most people watching it back then knew it was absurd. What it did, it encouraged students at school when they heard the air raid sirens go off to literally duck and cover underneath your chair in your classroom, which is going to do absolutely nothing to help you if you're nuked, but it apparently made folks feel better. I'm actually old enough to remember in LA doing duck and cover practices. A more useful film you're going to watch, useful in the sense that this is going to protect you a lot more from nuclear explosion, is this 2-part film you're going to be watching about fallout shelters. And there were social scientists and other scientists studying how Americans can live in fallout shelters up to like 1 or 2 years, right, until radiation dissipates, until at least it gets a little less. And you know who they studied? A lot of scientists studied the life of ants. And they said, you know what, ants are social beings and so are we. So we can kind of live underground, kind of like ants. And these fallout shelters are throughout the United States. Have any of you all seen this fallout shelter sign? They're pretty ubiquitous in cities. And I don't know where there's one in Reading, but I heard there was one, and I only researched this about an hour ago. So I don't know where there's one in Reading or maybe where you see. Why isn't the turtle a duck? Why not go full on pun? Oh, that's funny. Well, you know why Bert is a duck? Is because when the bomb comes, he puts his head inside the shell, right? He ducks and covers. Yeah, there's Bert right there. Huh, thanks, Ari. So this is one thing Americans were doing, the government was doing, and this is called the kitty cocoon, right? Making it kind of cutesy. You can go live under your kitty cocoon for a couple years. And Americans were buying these, Americans who could afford them. Here's your own backyard bomb shelter you can buy. This one's being advertised in West Los Angeles. And of course they had an actress model modeling it, right? Sex sells, and here's Mary Lou Minor saying you can for only $1,250 and you could buy it in installments if you didn't have that much money right away. And look at your bomb shelter had its own address, and you just go down there and live with your family. There's an add-on you can't find at Home Depot anymore. So this is all to say that the specter of nuclear war, you cannot forget that when thinking about the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and even today, right? Many social scientists say we don't know what happened to a lot of the Soviet Union's old nuclear bombs. They might be in hands of nefarious or stateless people. So the US and the USSR were experiencing an arms race, see who could build more ballistic missiles, nuclear weaponry, and also a space race, okay? Oh, by the way, you'll get this in a future lecture. The bluish areas are allied with the United States and Western Europe. And the red and pinkish areas are allied somewhat with either the Soviet Union or with China. So this is an image of how the Cold War divided the world between those who were pro-NATO or pro-United States and Western Europe, and those who were on pro, or at least being forced to be pro-Soviet Union or China.
What are the X's on this?
Go ahead.
There are like red X's in blue countries and blue X's in red countries. What are those?
Yeah, so in assignment 3, part 3, I'm going to be talking about the international scene of the Cold War. And the X's mark places where the Cold War was not cold. The reason why we call it the Cold War is because the Soviet Union and the US never nuked each other, right? It never turned hot in that sense. However, the Cold War was hot for millions of people around the globe.
The war that could have been much warmer.
I'm sorry?
I was just making a joke. I said it's the war that could have been much warmer.
Yeah, you're right. It could have been hot. Nobody got nuked, right? There hasn't been any nuking of anybody since we nuked Japan. Well, other than the tests, right? Vietnam, all these areas, Afghanistan, in which Korea, the Korean Peninsula should have a little X on it as well, where there was conflicts basically between the United States and the Soviet Union and the United States and China, right? Hot military conflicts but not in our backyard, but in these other folks' backyards. So that's assignment 3, part 3, coming soon.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, ma'am.
You might be getting to this point, and I'm sorry if you are, but you know, I have a basic understanding of what the Cold War is, but the one like kind of question that I've just never really seen addressed, which is sort of weird, is like, what is the United States motivation for fighting this? I mean, you know, the US gets involved in foreign stuff all the time, but you know, why are we so worried about other people's governments? You know?
All right, big question that I will address in part 3. But if you want to go ahead and look, check out the textbook. What the textbook talks about it. It's in chapter 28, I believe. But this is my whole lecture in assignment 3, part 3.
Okay, I will be patient then.
And it's basically geopolitical competition with Russia. There's all these former colonies in the world. Okay. I don't know if you're right, in the late 1800s, much of this area of the world and this area of the world was colonized by European countries to one extent or another.
Mhm.
So these countries after World War II are fighting for and winning their independence. And then what the United States and the Soviet Union both did to lesser or more extent was to try to get these countries to be on their side. And how do you get Angola to be on your side? Well, the United States tried something called bread or lead, accept our diplomacy, or we will militarily attack you in one way or another. And the Soviet Union had the same policy. So it's basically the US and the USSR fighting over dominance or alliances with these formerly colonized countries. How's that for a little primer for part 3?
That makes sense. Thank you.
Cool. So in other words, the Soviet Union and the United States were in competition at various levels, right? From the Olympics that happened every 4 years to the space race. For example, on October 5th, 1957, Russia launched up into space something about the size of a basketball. And it was the first man-made thing to orbit the Earth. Okay, the US was trying to launch something up there, but it takes, right? It's a lot of scientific work. So this really freaked out folks in the United States that, whoa, the Soviets beat us to space. So we were so shocked. So what did that inspire the United States government to do? It inspired it to keep spending on the military, despite the fact that historically, after the United States went to war with either Great Britain during the Independence Wars or the Civil War, after wars, governments tend to pare down their military quite a bit in order to save money, right? Because you don't need your military any longer. For example, after the Revolutionary War, Thomas Jefferson even wanted to get rid of the military altogether. Other folks like Hamilton and Washington said, yo, Jefferson, you peacenik hippie. No, not so fast. We need a military. So I think this graph shows that. Here's after the War of 1815, we spent less on the military. After the Civil War ended, the US government spent a lot less. After World War I, we went down. And during World War II, we spent a lot, and it did come down, but it didn't come down to the extent it did after other wars. My point is that the US government continued to invest in military spending all the way through in the decades that followed World War II. And how did this happen? And who was at the helm when this happened? Who was in the executive branch was a World War II hero and new time Republican Eisenhower. Actually, after World War II, both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party were trying to get Eisenhower to run on their ticket to be president because he was very popular. He ended up choosing the Republican Party. However, even though he was a Republican, he continued New Deal economic policies. And he did that because they were very popular. Americans loved the New Deal economic policies because it gave them employment and gave them infrastructure. He chose as his running mate, right, this guy from Fullerton, California, vice president from Whittier, California, down in LA, Vice President Richard Nixon, who will become a future president. Ike, people liked Ike, right? Not everybody. A lot of people, well, of course, not everybody liked him, but he seemed like, right, mainstream, sweet white guy America. He liked poker, bourbon, fishing, hunting, golf, right? He was a World War II era. He was a World War II commander in the European front, and he was at the helm during the 1950s. And as I said, he continued these Keynesian economic policies, this mouthful of a word, which just means that the government and private industry are going to continue to play active parts in our economy. An example of this is he named the CEO of General Motors, this guy, Charles Wilson, as the Secretary of Defense. And Charles Wilson famously said, "What is good for General Motors is good for America."
Is this,
Go ahead.
what, I mean, now in politics, we have like CEOs and business people in positions all the time. Is this, when this happens, is that a new thing or has that always been happening?
No, it was a relatively new thing because corporations didn't become as large and influential until the late early 1900s.
Okay.
Right. So it's a continuation of something that started to happen, I would say, during the Gilded Age. Great question.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm not saying that Eisenhower administration started this. It started like the early 1900s. Remember when we talked about how business was very powerful? Okay. However, immediately after the war in the early 1950s, there was an economic slump for various reasons, overproduction, et cetera. And many millions of union workers went on strike to demand better wages, right? 5 out of 14 million union working Americans went on strike. And the federal government was like, okay, gosh, what are we gonna do? So there was a little bit of pullback on New Deal programs. And here's an example I bring up because it was a compromise that business and workers made and that Democrats and Republicans agreed to. This is a compromise. Again, compromise is something that both sides equally dislike, is the old joke. So this thing called the Taft-Hartley Bill, on one hand, it weakened unions. It did, right? And it also ruled that union-only shops were illegal. For example, a lot of businesses by this time said, a lot of unions said, hey, if you're going to come work for General Motors, you have to be part of the union, right? The federal government deemed that illegal. So workers were now free to choose whether they were going to be members of the union, paying members of the union or not. And this is something unions have been fighting for ever since. So on one hand, there was a weakening of unions. On the other hand, the unions that did exist started to unify. The biggest unification was the AFL and CIO, right? And there's a lot of dirty business happening with the AFL and CIO and with General Motors all across, and you probably hear more about that. But the positive thing the AFL-CIO did do for its workers is that it won them better contracts. Because they were a bigger entity, they could bargain with business and it carried more weight. So my larger question to you is, what factors led to American prosperity? Well, on one hand, stronger unions, despite the fact that there were moves to weaken unions, right? It's complicated. Another factor that led to US prosperity is that Detroit retooled. Oh, somebody's coming in and chatting. Ike is Eisenhower's first name, I believe. I'm sorry, yes. Ike is short for, Ike is actually short for Eisenhower. Why is it Ike? Let's go back to Eisenhower. Dwight is his first name. So Dwight is his first name and Ike is just a short for Eisenhower. I don't actually know exactly why. Good question. So sorry about that I didn't explain that. So when Detroit during World War II was making machines for war, Now Detroit's going to retool, and what's Detroit going to start pumping out by the millions? What are they going to start to make?
Cars.
Motor Town, right? USA for national consumption. Now these assembly lines are making cars. And as you'll know, during World War II, remember seeing images of women on the assembly lines and African Americans? After World War II, when many white Americans came back, a lot of those last hired, first fired, were forced out of these really high paying jobs. And all this led to the United States becoming the most wealthy nation and the most powerful nation, arguably, in the world, right? Even though the United States only had 7% of the world's population, we were the world's #1 economy. And that's, you have to kind of wrap your head around that, right? Only 7% of the people of the world, yet #1 economy. We made 2/3 of the world's stuff. We no longer do, but during that time, we made a lot. And we accounted for 40% of the world's wealth, right? And again, stop me for questions if you wish. What were some of the manifestations of this economic boom? Well, Americans started driving. American companies started to produce these big steel internally combusted behemoths, and Americans started buying them, right? 400% increase in driving. What my uncle jokingly says, life behind the windshield began. And Americans are also moving into suburbs, which I'll get into in a second. Even if you look at an Oldsmobile advertisement from 1950, this captures the space race, the space age. It says rocket ahead with Oldsmobile, right? So it was just an era in which the Cold War space and arms race were front and center. So where are all these cars going to drive? How are they going to get around? Well, for the time, the biggest federal program ever at that time was the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. So interestingly, it was a Republican administration who proposed this biggest federal investment program in our history. And it was just another example in which Eisenhower and the rest of the country really did like these New Deal programs. And they're going to build all kinds of roads. But a lot of fiscal conservatives were worried that, wait a minute, the government's going to big time debt. Why don't we do this privately? Well, Eisenhower was a brilliant politician, and he argued, he said, hey, we need this highway, we need highways to crisscross our nation, because what happens if the Soviets invade? We need to move troops to Seattle, Florida, who knows where they might invade. And this, right, speaking to the pro-militaristic aspect of fiscal conservatives, it passed. It passed both House and Congress. And the result of which was I-5, I-80. Could you imagine Reading without I-5? I mean, it would just be much, much different. Look at all these federal highways that were built because of this program. The United States would be unrecognizable without this highway system. For good, you know, the good and the bad and the ugly of it all. And here's a celebration of the opening of the Santa Monica Freeway. The I-10, I know that freeway oh so well. So here's the grand opening of the Santa Monica Freeway. And of course, they brought some beauty queens. So you see the gendered aspect of it. None of the guys are in their Speedos, right? By the way, this is the future first Black mayor of Los Angeles, Tom Bradley, over here in the background. How long did it take to build a highway? Ooh, a long time. This was a decades-long project, right? For example, the Federal Highway Act was started in 1956. This highway was not open until 9 years later. So that's one example. It takes yeah, and the women are so much more younger, exactly. And they're not dressed in pantsuits either. So it shows you just the, continued sexist nature of highway opening at in this juncture. The women are much younger, yeah. How did the federal government pay for all this? How do you think they paid for all this massive investment? Younger, more popular. Yeah, I know, James Bond, troubling. I hear you, Ari. How did the federal government pay for this? Any guesses? Taxes, yeah, not just gas tax, but tax. From the 1950s all the way to about 1976, right, was this era in which the United States taxed wealthy people and corporations way more than they do today, way more, especially after the 2016 or 17 tax bill passed. So during this era, corporations were taxed at 50%. I personally am taxed about 33% of all my income goes to state, federal, and local taxes, right? Today, 30%, a community college guy. Back then, top earners, wealthy folks, paid 70% of their income was taxed. Today, top earners pay 17% and almost nothing, right? You heard the recent news about how much Trump paid last year in federal taxes. I mean, I think a minimum wage gardener paid more than he did. Did you all hear how much Trump paid the last 2 years in taxes?
Wasn't it like $200 or some absurdly low?
$750.
750, that was it.
750. Oh my gosh, right? A part-time barista at Starbucks pays twice that. Today, corporations pay about 35% tax. It's lower after 2016. Then corporations paid about 50% in tax. All right, and this is way more complicated. There's a lot of loopholes that wealthy people with their lawyers can get around. But this is one of the ways in which the federal government was able to pay all these massive programs through increasing taxation. This kind of taxation is called progressive taxation, where you tax wealthier people more. Regressive taxation is what we're experiencing now, where you tax poor people more. And a lot of economists even call things like speeding ticket something that's regressive taxation. How are counties making money and paying for stuff? Increasing number of traffic tickets, for example. Another way the federal government paid for this was cutting programs, often cutting programs to urban areas, to federally recognized tribes. Remember, during the conquest and development of the West, the federal government made treaties with various indigenous groups saying, hey, stay on the reservation and we will give you monthly checks or annual checks, whatever it was. But come the 1950s, the federal government cut many expenditures to 61 tribes in violation of those treaties, but also saving a lot of money. Another thing that the federal government invested in between 1944 and 1971, the federal government invested $95 billion. It's a lot of money back in that day, in something called the GI Bill. Okay, and you all might be familiar with the GI Bill. Those of you in the military still might be beneficiaries of the GI Bill. I think we should triple the GI Bill for all veterans then and now. And one thing the GI Bill did was to allow Americans who couldn't afford to go to college to go to college. For example, my grandfather was able to get a degree through the GI Bill because he's a veteran of the Navy. No way, before the GI Bill, only wealthy people could afford to go to college. Another thing that came out of the GI Bill, do you notice these classes are super packed? And you all might be familiar with very crowded classes like we have at Shasta College in the 800 building. Well, previously, colleges were not designed that way because only a small handful of wealthy people students would be able to go to school. Now with the GI Bill, you had to build these big, huge, like auditorium type things to house all the students that are coming to your college. Another thing the GI Bill did, another thing the federal government did to invest in the millions of veterans of World War II was to help veterans buy homes, right? And there was something called the GI Bill of Rights. So 13 million new homes were sold at low interest rates, government subsidized low interest rates, and with a 30-year mortgage. So American veterans could buy a home, a farm, all right? And this is boom. Where did they buy homes and farms? Well, in these booming new suburban communities that they could drive to in their car on the newly built highways. And for example, you're going to be watching this Levittown, Pennsylvania advertisement for their neighborhood. And you got to, for example, choose from 4 different styles of house, right? In Levittown, Pennsylvania, you can get this one, that one, or that one. And it's just a boom in the suburbs, big time suburban boom. And it was advertised everywhere. And there's Levittown, Pennsylvania, New York, and suburbs were everywhere. I'm just giving you the example of Levittown because it was one big company who made all these houses. Levitt plans, low-priced homes suitable for any wage earner. And bam, many Americans could now afford this suburban lifestyle. This image is probably very familiar to you, right? All these homes that were built in factories, assembly line factories, and they were brought prefab built, right, to the site and then put all together. Bought on credit, massive use of materials to, right, asphalt the roads and to build the roofs and this infrastructure, et cetera. And another, if you want to explore another aspect of it, if you want to analyze the impact on the environment, right, a lot of open land and farms were now turned into suburbs, right? Just do a Google Earth of like Phoenix, Arizona. Oh my gosh, it's freaking incredible. However, who moved there? A lot of white Americans, mostly white Americans, left cities and moved to suburbs. They left ethnically diverse, multi-generational urban neighborhoods. And I'm sharing this with you mostly to share this great image. This is an Italian neighborhood in Queens, New York, right? And here's the sailor. He might be, so he's got a sailor's hat on, right? Walking by these Italian American ladies. Why white flight? Why didn't other ethnicities, do you think, move to the suburbs? What do you think, Joey, Ari, or Rachel?
Redlining.
Woo, who said that? Rachel? What is
Rachel.
redlining?
That is basically when if I remember correctly, there are like rules written into the mortgages where Black people can't move, or people of color in general can't move into these towns. And I believe I've heard that in some mortgage loans, a stipulation was that you couldn't sell to a family of color in the future too.
Yeah, this was part of the federal program, part of local programs, and part of private banking policies. And you're exactly right, Rachel. Thank you. You must have had Wiley's class, I bet. You all are going to be listening to, I think, a 20-minute radio report about this. And this is an example of Los Angeles and its race-based lending practices. The green and blue areas are highly desirable. And if you're a person of color, you would not be able to get a mortgage to live there. You could only get a mortgage in the yellow or red places, okay? So it's straight up race-based lending. It didn't matter how much money you had, right? You still couldn't get a mortgage to buy there. When in fact, one example of African-American family were able to rent a house in Levittown, boom, the white community just lost it. Signs started to pop up in Levittown. Is this New York? Yeah, Levittown, New York. We want tenants in our white community. And the signs on the right say, we intend to keep this neighborhood white. We want this N-word moved. And look at these, right? Can we call them 1950s Karens here protesting?
I think all white women in the 1950s were Karens.
You know what? You're going to see an example of this woman here who, I hear what you're saying, but you're going to see an example of, oh, dang it, where is she? Her. Miss America 1951. Oh, I don't know. Was no Karen. She was yeah, she was Miss America, and she also was an activist on various levels.
That's awesome. I was
Yeah.
mostly joking. I mean, obviously not everyone was, but that's cool.
No, I get what you mean, and you're right. Probably the majority of folks were, right, men and women. But I'm going to give you an example of this woman who was educated in a Catholic school in Alabama, who ended up being one of the spokespeople of a generation, right? So you get to read this cool bio of her. And please don't believe me, here is the newspaper report. Quote, only Negro family ordered out in Levittown, New York. The only Negro family living in Levittown, New York was ordered to move out by a district judge. Mr. and Mrs. William Cotter and their 5 children were told to get out by October 30th by Judge Samuel Greason after a court jury upheld claims of the Morris Management Incorporation, developers of the town. Cotter, who moved into the town, here we go, here's another good example. Cotter, who moved into the town 13 months ago, said a white family sublet a house to him after the management refused to rent to him because of his race. He said he will appeal the decision. Hey, so there's another example of a white family renting their house to this African-American family, even though they were kicked out. Isn't that messed up? Yeah, Joey, yay. What was the impact on the inner cities when there was this white flight to the suburbs and people of color were not allowed to move out to the suburbs? Well, it led to urban decay. Inner cities started to lose their economic base. Schools started to lose their tax base, right? So basically a segregation of America. Many businesses left to the suburbs. And in 1962, a full 25% of Americans were in poverty, and it was mostly elderly and minority people who were impoverished. What's the result of this? Well, we're gonna talk about this in assignment 3, part 2. It led to inner city rebellions, right? In the 1960s in Watts, in Detroit, in LA, in Chicago, in New York, there were just urban uprisings, right? Protesting this institutional racism. Okay, that's all I have for this. Stay on if you want to have questions. I'm just going to stop the recording right now. If you have any questions, please Zoom me, everybody. Zoom me for questions about this.